Welcome everyone to Taking a Fabric First Approach webinar, one of the learning modules in the fabric and structure of a net zero build project, which is part of the low carbon learning programme. This programme aims to support industry working towards achieving net zero in the built environment. Today we will show how using fabric first principles help to make more current and future energy efficient requirements towards achieving zero carbon and near zero energy homes. This approach to design and construction aims to minimise the requirement for heating and cooling of the property. Fabric First requires the design to be looked at holistically to establish both the thermal performance of each individual component and how it will function as a whole when installed. This project is part funded by Skills Development Scotland as part of the National Transition Training Fund, with an aim to support those working in industry to develop more green skills. The desire to upskill in low carbon construction has never been more relevant. Over the next few weeks, we'll be offering fully funded training with online modules and practical training at our innovation factory. Our focus is in 4 key areas: taking a fabric first approach and the drive towards greater energy efficiency, carbon accounting and why this is helping industry work towards achieving net zero, mass timber solutions, and developing an understanding of the processes and practices of sustainable insulation and materials. Training will consist of immersive training, which will be available at the end of June, and practical training, which will take place at our innovation factory throughout the month of May. Spaces on the practical training courses are limited, so make sure you book your space after the webinar today. All the training sessions are free. My name is Kaye Kennan. I am an impact manager of Modern Methods of Construction at BEST, formerly known as Construction Scotland Innovation Centre. And if you have any questions regarding this project, please get in touch. Today we are going to hear from some experts who are leading the way around driving net zero in the built environment. First of all, we'll have Trish Andrews, who is a training manager at ACB and will be developing the content for the first module. We'll also hear from Duncan Ainsley, who works for ACB and has devoted much of his career to finding energy efficiency solutions. And also we'll hear from Sara Edmonds, who's an architect who runs Studio Research. Before I hand over to our first speaker today, I just want to cover some housekeeping with you. If you want to ask a question, please click on the question icon and post it there, and we'll try to answer it in our Q&A slot. The webinar will be recorded and the link will be posted in social network channels. Finally, there will be some polls throughout the webinar, which we are keen for you to participate in. And after the webinar, there will be an evaluation form that we will ask you to please complete, as it helps us provide the best service we possibly can. Here is a short video capturing our project. Now it's time for our first poll question. On a scale of 1 to 5, what is your level of knowledge of net zero buildings, fabric and structure standards in the built environment? Okay. Now, okay, so it's come up 42%. Have some knowledge. Yes, that's quite good to see. So now I'm going to hand you over to Trish, AACB's training manager, Trish helped AACB achieve its recognition and alignment with PAS 2035 and making the Carbon Light course Retrofit Coordinator ready. With a passion for sustainable design and architecture, Trish qualified as an architect in 1999, and she also worked at CAT as a senior lecturer. Hi, Trish.
Thanks, Kaye. I'll just share my screen. Is that working?
Yep, we can see that fine, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to this new venture in training. I'd just like to say two things. Number one, I have a very sore throat, so I might be a bit croaky and have to drink a hot drink, but please bear with me. Okay, so today we're delighted to welcome you in our collaboration with BEST as part of their low carbon learning programme to provide and present to you an introduction to our Fabric First approach module. So we are the ACB. What does that mean? Who are we? The ACB is the Association for Environment Conscious Building. Basically, we're a network of individuals, companies, and who want to promote sustainable building. We've been running since the 1980s, and we are the oldest and largest network for sustainable building in the UK. What we do is we bring together people like yourselves, tradespeople, contractors, architects, engineers, social housing, local authorities, other academics and individuals to try and share, to train and promote sustainable building and best practice. Why do we do it? We do it because we want to educate and help affect deep lasting change within the construction industry at large. We want to be part of the better change in our lives where people through building have better comfort, better health and sustainability within their homes. We're run by our members as an independent not-for-profit organisation. We have written a few standards, mostly building standards. The ACB Building Standard and the ACB Retrofit Standard are certified processes which you can choose as a target to fit in line with your retrofit project and to work towards. We also have the ACB Lifetime Carbon Standard, the ACB Water Standard and the ACB Daylight Standard. And these are all available freely on our website if you're interested in working towards a standard. One of our main divisions is that we offer training. We have three large training offerings, or main ones rather. The ACB Retrofit Foundation course. This is our oldest and longest course, which we launched, I think, in 2016. And it is a holistic approach to retrofit. It basically looks at the reasons why we need to retrofit, so climate change, the big issues, right down to building physics, looking at moisture in buildings, looking at ventilation, and then how to cost retrofit. Our second course is available now, and it is our new Carbon Light Retrofit Coordination course launched this year. It basically looks at risk management in retrofit. It follows the PAS 2035 process and framework and the rules therein, looking at how we can better manage and risk manage retrofit projects at scale and individually. Our third offering is a CPD certificate in building energy modelling using PHPP in collaboration with TU Dublin. That's a course for those who want to use PHPP but don't understand it fully, so you could take a project from inception to completion. We also provide other bespoke training with other partners and organisations, so get in touch if you are interested. These range from, but are not restricted to, domestic retrofit, fabric first approach, which we're looking at a little bit today, understanding building physics, the ACB building standards and how you can apply them in your projects, PHPP software for any of those who don't know, that's the planning house planning package software, and PH Ribbon software, which is a derivative we've developed with Tim Martell. So if you're interested in any training, have any requests, want to know more about membership, please do get in touch at training@acb.net. Thank you for your time this morning.
Kaye, you're still on mute.
Thanks, Trish. It's really good to understand more about the work that you and AACB are doing, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to ask Trish some questions, so please post them in the chat box, and we'll then move on to a Q&A session after the presentations. So now it's time for our next poll question. So the next poll question is, where within the built environment do you feel that net zero building, low carbon learning, upskilling is most required? Okay, and that's interesting. Come up construction policy and standards, both at 35%, building services 6%. Okay. So next we're going to hear from Duncan Smith. Duncan has over 30 years experience in construction and the energy industry, working within both public and private sectors in the UK, Europe and Australia. He's worked with several companies, including Scottish Power, Clark Contract for 7 homes, and several local authorities, including Renfrewshire Council. Duncan holds qualifications in site management, residential surveying and construction. And now Duncan also works for AACB and has devoted much of his career to finding energy efficiency solutions in social housing and local authorities. So, welcome, Duncan.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. It's nice to be here. I'm just going to fly through some of these slides and see if between myself and Sara and Trish we can maybe have, if it's okay with the team at best, a wee bit more of a chat around some of the topics we've been discussing. But just give you a wee introduction about me. Yeah, I'm the Chief Operating Officer as well as External Affairs Director at the ACB. And it makes me feel very old when somebody says 30 years experience. I have to look at the grey hairs coming in. But my background is in a mixture of construction, retrofit and energy. So I really do have quite I suppose, a passion for retrofit and how we upgrade the buildings that we have. Been involved in policy development. People work with Scottish Government as well as the United Nations on developing policies around retrofit and been parts of lots of different working groups and so on. What I want to try and do today is take a wee bit more of a higher level approach just in terms of the connection between the built environment, fabric first, climate change and fuel poverty, and just to kind of frame the argument and start to look at how we're going to join some dots to the presentation. I think it's fair to say we're going to live over a period of significant radical change in terms of how we heat and power our buildings over the coming decade and beyond. And I think it's worthwhile just to pause and reflect on some of the changes that we're going to have to make. It will be quite a radical transformation and there will be challenges in that, but also opportunities. And the reason that I want to talk about or tie in climate change in the built environment, I'll show in some slides coming up, is if we don't embrace the challenge we have, if we don't meet our climate change objectives, we will create a much warmer, much less hospitable climate for our children. And it is a really important point to link the built environment and climate change. And the reason I like this particular slide here is a door that we can walk through. It's a metaphorical door that if we get it right, we can have a much better future. But if we get it wrong, there's some real problems that we face, and not just people watching this webinar just now, but our kids and future generations. And to tie in the built environment and climate change, just want to do some key facts just to kind of, again, frame the argument. About 80% of the homes that will be around in 2050 when some of the targets are due have already been built. So they're already here, we're already living in them. And we can't build our way out of climate change. By that I mean we can't build new homes to replace the ones we already have. So we've got to tackle what's here. 20% of, directly 20% of emissions come from heat and hot water from our buildings. So a significant proportion of carbon comes from how we heat and power our homes, and that's comparable with cars. I'll talk a wee bit later on about the cost, because there is a social cost to this as well as environmental. But what's our government doing? Our government here in Scotland, well, fairness, is pretty progressive. We've got some standards that I've been involved in working with the Scottish Government on for energy efficiency. The main thing that people might be familiar with is isnt, but also quite a significant drive towards heat pumps and heat and building strategy. HIBS has quite clear directions in terms of 1 million heat pumps by 2030. And fuel poverty legislation, interestingly, throughout the whole of the UK, I could be wrong here, but I think throughout the whole of the UK, we've actually enshrined in legislation that no one or less than 5% of people should be in fuel poverty by 2040, I think. Fundamentally overarching all of this is Scotland's ambitions to become a net zero country, a net zero society by 2045. That's 5 years ahead of Westminster. And back to this transition and joining the dots again and looking at some of the policies there, there's a huge amount of homes that will have to be switched from gas to electric or low carbon heat networks, things like district heating. And that's going to require a huge amount of generating capacity, and also how we bring that electricity to our homes through the existing network. But to give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here, if you look at the 2 million homes that will have to be transitioned to a different type of heating from gas, starting from just now to 2035, that's the equivalent of about 12,000 homes per month. So that's the size of a town of, say, Larkhall or Kilwinning or Johnson, switched every month from gas to some other form of low carbon sustainable heating. So it's a huge challenge that we have, and we'll have to have smarter generating and storage capacities as well. So just to frame again the transition that we're going to have to go through. But the cost to society just now, because what a lot of people will say about some of the topics we discussed in Fabric Approach and reducing carbon, reducing demand is, well, it's expensive, it's costly. Where is the cost, or how much will this cost us? And I would actually take this back and argue about present day. If you do some very rudimentary figures just now, you'll see that us Scots spend about £5 billion a year. Our average bills are about £2,000 a year. And we're looking at 40% of Scots being in fuel poverty, potentially, in the autumn of this year after the other price increase. It's currently 25%, 1 in 4 Scots to 4 in 10 Scots potentially in fuel poverty. So there's a huge social issue as well as a climate issue just now about how we heat our buildings and how we provide sustainable homes. And in direct relation to the Fabric model, or the Fabric First module that we've developed, our homes here in the UK, here in Scotland, are some of the least efficient, some of the leakiest from an energy perspective in Europe. Higher proportion of flats in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and a proportion of private landlords slightly smaller than the UK, and a little bit more social housing. That's the kind of dynamic. But we have a significant problem within our housing stock and how we make it more efficient, how we reduce demand. Just want to highlight a wee slide here that shows you that. About 60% of homes in Scotland are owner occupied, little under 20% are private rented, and about a quarter are social rented. But the most interesting chart is the one on the right hand side, which shows that over 30% of our buildings are 80 years old. So, built with different construction materials, different methods, quite old, quite inefficient, and that's some of the properties that we need to treat. Only 20%, actually 18% of our homes were built since 1990. So a real issue with this historic stock, how it was constructed, how it was built. How do we measure performance? We can talk about this a little bit just now, but I'd be keen to open this up for a debate in the chat. But we measure performance through things like EPCs, how SAP can generate those EPCs and design SAP, as well as passive house planning package. So there's tools out there on how we measure buildings. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with all of them. But really, how we should be looking about measuring our buildings is through the kilowatt hours per square metre. It's through the demand that our homes need for energy, because only then, if we reduce that, will we fundamentally address the climate issues around the carbon that we emit, as well as the fuel poverty that households have. So sustainable retrofit and sustainable homes is closely tied up in building physics and a fabric first approach and reducing demand, and how we do that through this chart here. I won't cover this too much. This is just some examples of work that my team was involved in about a year and a half ago, and how we can upgrade properties. This block is a 1930s block that was retrofitted to quite a high standard, and the primary focus is on reducing demand within that block, and how we can do that through a fabric first, through insulation, air tightness, mechanical ventilation. And this method really is is a future-proofing method because it allows the transition to low-carbon heating or renewables in a way that's sustainable, not just environmentally, but sustainable socially, and that residents won't pay more for renewable heating. And I just want to finish off with a couple of slides because we talk a lot about the challenge, and we talk about that, or we look at that through a lens of the difficulties and the problems that we'll face. But I want to again reframe this, because with a fabric first approach, with an approach that significantly reduces the demand that our homes need for heating, we can actually look at the positives about how we can change that challenge into an opportunity to create an economy which is more sophisticated around construction and how that can have an impact on our health. We live in our homes. If our homes are significantly more energy efficient, healthier, air quality is better, these all have an impact. Of course, it has an impact on the environment through reduced emissions, but also society as well. We can't spend the money that we're spending just now on heating our homes and for it not to have an impact on society. That has we have an opportunity to move away from spending vast amounts of money on heating our homes to on something that's more viable, more sustainable. So I'm trying to show how we shouldn't look at housing in its own little silo, that it is interconnected into the environment, the economy, health and society. And just to leave you with one quote from Chris Stark, who's the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. In terms of overall climate, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? I think it's a great quote because I think it's a kind of call to action about how we can all play a part in reducing our energy consumption, our energy demand. And that's me. Okay.
Yep. Thanks, Duncan. I'm sure lots of people will have some questions for you later on when we have our chat. So before we move on to our Q&A session, our final speaker today is Sara Edmonds, an architect who runs Studio Search with her husband in London. They've recently co-founded Home Energy Action Lab, a community retrofit social enterprise. She's a coordinator of the Architect Climate Action Network and co-founding a campaign called Households Declare. Working in the face of a climate emergency, the focus of Sara's work is to drive systemic change in the built environment and wider communities through bottom-up grassroots projects and strategies. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks, Kaye. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for introducing me. Yeah, I wear many hats, and I suppose the most important one is the fact that I am a keen collaborator. But I'm an architect and recently now a passive house designer as well. And I am on the steering group in ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network, where I co-founded the Households Declare campaign and have recently co-founded HEAL, Home Energy Action Lab, which is a social enterprise in my community. And I co-host Zero Ambitions podcast with Duncan, actually. So we all collaborate here in different ways. My focus areas are really in domestic retrofit and demand reduction, but also significantly in campaigning, collaborating and movement building. And with that in mind, public awareness and communication are key. So I know Duncan, we're all aware of the context. I know Duncan has touched on this, but I also just want to give the kind of global context. So temperatures have increased over 1.2 degrees, and this graph says more than I can put together in words, but we are heading in the wrong direction. What that means is that extreme weather events are becoming more and more commonplace, and anybody who's watching the news right now will know what's happening with heat waves in India, but it's not, you know, other parts of the world where this is happening. You know, this happens here on our doorstep with flooding becoming more of an issue, and also with wildfires that we've seen in Northern Ireland recently. So the best way I can describe what's happening is to borrow from the economist Kaye. This is a donut. It's a new way of framing what we previously have looked at as exponential growth in measuring GDP. This is the donut, which consists of two concentric rings. It's an alternative way of looking at what a thriving planet looks like. So at the core, we've got the social foundation to ensure that no one is left falling short of life's essentials. And at the top, we've got an ecological ceiling to ensure that humanity does not collectively overshoot the planetary boundaries that protect Earth's life supporting systems. And then between those two sets of boundaries lies the donut-shaped space that is both ecologically safe and socially just, and a space where humanity can thrive. But this is where the globe is. And in fact, this isn't even the most up-to-date one. And it is a bit terrifying, but this is why we need to be acting now. So what's the national context? Well, we know that the UK won't meet its legally binding targets of net zero by 2050 without near complete decarbonisation of the existing building stock. Lots of organisations, and possibly some of you on the call today, are part of organisations calling for a national retrofit strategy. We need an immense expansion of trades and professionals to meet this challenge. The CLC has put that number at 500,000 roles, and I think the Scottish Government are saying 22,500 roles every year until 2028, so it's no mean feat. But this is where organisations like BEST and the ACB really matter, because they're mobilising all of their abilities and resources and joining forces across the industry to help address the skills and knowledge shortage. So one of those is the Fabric First module, and this is the result of some collective collaboration between the ACB, BEST and us at Studio Search. The module will set out to give a sort of a broad grounding in the topic, and I'm imagining that a lot of you on the call are really familiar with all of these, the components of this Fabric First module. So what I would encourage you to do is to share this far and wide amongst your colleagues, anybody that you think could benefit from this. So we'll cover topics that range from the opportunities and the benefits and the drivers, and I think that's the most important part of it, because really, as Duncan mentioned, it's about reframing this as an opportunity. Yes, there are barriers and obstacles, yes, there are challenges and risks to be managed, but all of those things point to areas where we can drive our energy to actually bring this into the fore and make this a really thriving sector within the industry. So in this module, the learning outcomes, they're mainly, again, as I say, set to give you a contextual understanding of what it means when we talk about Fabric First, what those barriers, drivers, challenges, but opportunities and benefits are, how you might understand some of the practices and processes involved, and to generally understand, like to improve your understanding of the need for this, and why it's actually important to be at the fore, because policy isn't changing maybe fast enough, but the industry surely is. So this will really help in giving you that grounding, and then in pointing on where your next steps should be in your education and your knowledge share. So what is a Fabric First approach? Well, I think you probably all know that this means optimizing the performance of the components and materials that make up the matter of your building, so the walls, the floors, the roofs. So improving them, optimizing them, making sure they're working as hard as possible before you consider your systems, you know, such as your heating or renewables. And those principles really are about maximizing air tightness, optimizing solar gain, whether that's in new build or in retrofit. There are things that you can do in both scenarios. It's about increasing levels of insulation in the fabric, optimizing natural ventilation, and using the thermal mass of the building fabric. But I really don't want to talk too much about that now, because the course content itself will be really useful, really thorough, and point you to lots of industry documentation and support. But I think what we'd like to do is just have a discussion really more about how we can really spread this knowledge as far and as wide as we possibly can, because really collaboration is where we all got to be right now, and we've all got to be able to come together. And if you all in this room, because I do feel like we're speaking to quite a knowledgeable room, if you know a lot about this, there are a vast number of spaces that BEST are providing. So share it wide and get as many people up to your level of understanding as possible. We know there's no silver bullet, so we know that it's tricky. We know that there are there are challenges here, but no more than just any form of construction. So I hope that we can start to talk about this as commonplace as we talk about other challenges across the construction industry. Yeah, so thank you, and I hope we can have some good questions in the conversation now.
Thanks, Sarah. Now, before we go on to the Q&A session, it's time for our final poll of today. So the final poll is, what area of net zero building, low carbon learning would be most valuable to you or your business? Is it fabric first training, sustainable insulation training, mass timber training, carbon accounting standards, or passive house standards? That's good to see that it's fabric first training. That's good that it's the relevant people who are on it today are interested in the actual training. As I've said, the training will take place with the module and also practical training at the factory. Now, just to reiterate, the training spaces in the factory are limited. So if you want to come to the practical training day on Wednesday, the 11th of May, you can sign on for it right after the webinar. So now we've got time for a Q&A session. So just looking at opening it up to the panel. We've got a question here and it's asking, is retrofit focused on housing rather than public buildings or offices, as this will have a bigger effect on reducing energy use? So
yeah, so our standards, the retrofit standard, I'm conscious though that we are not, just to be clear, we're not specifically selling ACB standards here. This is a fabric first course. So sometimes I feel if we get caught up too much in specific standards that it might kind of drive the conversation away from the overall principles. But to answer the question, the retrofit standard that we have is primarily for housing and not for public buildings. There has been some work actually in public buildings, quite a lot of good work that Edinburgh's done recently, as well as Scottish Futures Trust in terms of developing a net zero public buildings standard. Is that the best way to describe it? So no, retrofit, the standard that ACB have is primarily for. That's not to say we can't look at something in the future, but we'd have to go in and have a think about that.
We've got another question here. Again, it's just very, very similar. Can ACB retrofit standards be applied to public buildings, offices and schools? So it seems to be questions around the ACB standards.
I don't know, without being too controversial, I don't know I would agree with the take on in terms of a bigger impact than public buildings would have. I think domestically there's a significant impact we can have domestically. I wouldn't agree with that point about, I mean, sure, you can have a big impact with a small amount of public buildings with a high demand, but certainly from an overall energy demand perspective, I think housing plays a significant part in the demand that we, and in fabric first.
If I can add to that, what I was thinking about whilst Duncan was talking about that was, you know, my area of passion, I suppose, in this is in decarbonising our existing housing stock, so very much in retrofit and very much in the domestic sphere. And that comes from the statistic that we all know now very well, which is, you know, however way you chop it up, about 20% of total UK emissions comes from our homes, like a fifth across the whole of our emissions comes from our homes. Now, that's why I suppose our focus is there, because we're still lacking a national retrofit strategy. We still don't have enough incentive and enough support. We still don't have a deep enough understanding across the industry to help deliver the scale of what we need to deliver. But maybe what was coming from the person who asked that question's perspective might be that they work with public buildings and not so much with houses. So maybe you're looking for support in that. And I think my advice there would be to join as many of the conversations as you can around these things, and join different groups such as ACAN or LETI. So these are all volunteer organisations, but basically they're massive knowledge sinks, if you like, and lots of places that you can ask advice and understand what's happening right now, and what's the best, most concise bit of advice that you might have. I know there are, and I think what does happen with this Fabric First module is that we've got a significant sort of further reading section, but where we're pointing you to what we think are the most relevant bits of documentary evidence and support for things like that. So I think, yeah, there isn't really an easy answer for those things, but there is support and there is a lot of knowledge out there across the industry, and this course should give you that sort of, well, here's your grounding, and then this is the next place to look, or take yourself here, or a further opportunity to ask more questions of the network.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Another question that's come in is, do you think the PAS 2035 document should be the core of any retrofit process? So I'll open that up to the panel.
Yeah, gosh, there's the can of worms question, isn't there? I think what we have to remember is PAS 2035 isn't a standard. So PAS 2035 is something you mentioned. It is a process. It's a process document. So I think you have to separate them too. I happen to think that PAS 2035 is really good. It's really progressive. It allows or it focuses on good practice within the installation of retrofit measures. But I think what we have to get to, and that was hopefully what I tried to present in the slide, was, we can talk about EPCs, we can talk about energy ratings, but fundamentally, if you measure a property, a building, home, by how much energy it needs to heat, that's where the argument should be at. Now, I think what Sara, myself, and Trish all agree is there's even though the ECB has specific standards, there's a sort of pyramid of success, and where you have to really take things to is a combination of air tightness, kilowatt hours per square meter, and mechanical ventilation or good air quality. And I think as long as you're in that range, that's success. PAS 2035 as a tool for how you put things on and in a building will certainly help to get you there. But I wouldn't say it's a starting point. I think the starting point is about, Sarah's always got a really good phrase that she uses. I'm going to steal her thunder. But she always talks about pausing and reflecting on what the building's attributes, capabilities, what it is you want to do. And I think that's around building physics rather than specifically PAS 2035. But listen, feel free to disagree. It's a forum that we should have quite a kind of a robust debate.
I agree with that. So I think there's huge work put into the background around PAS 2035, and it's well worth getting familiar with and understanding, as you say, that it's a framework, it's not a standard per se, and what it's trying to do is to de-risk the process by really establishing the need for a whole building approach, one that is assessed properly. And that, I think, is the biggest area. I think we're all very, very keen to work out, okay, what do I do to my building to retrofit it? What should I be adding? What should I be acting on? And Duncan's right, the thing that I have been banging on a lot about is that pause, that moment first, where we get to know our building stock. You're not just going to start doing stuff to your building if you don't understand what impact that might have. And we now know more and more the importance of investing in these things, the cost of investment, the need for resilience, the need for future resilience, the need for moving out of the destructive processes and the one and done approach to things, but more the fact that we need to understand our buildings, we need to steward them, we need to look after them, we need to be good ancestors, we need all of those principles. We need to start shifting our focus away from the quick fix and more into how are we caring for these, and how are we shifting our perception away from how much does this stuff cost into what's the value that we're handing on. Because if you can imagine, we develop there are lots of pilot projects in happening all around the place at the minute, and people are recognizing that doing a single retrofit, great, fine if you can, but possibly not as impactful as it could be if that was done at a community scale. And there are all sorts of investigations into what sort of projects that might be. But if we can take that approach where we can collectively understand what works best for a given environment, whether that's a street or whether that's a number of buildings together, and really understand them, then you start to see how all these other so-called co-benefits, which are actually primary benefits to the community, so increasing local job creation, even that you're keeping your supply chain local, increasing the biodiversity in your area, like all those things are actually part of the kind of the retrofit first and fabric first approach to buildings. And it stands to be a really exciting and creative time, because you start to tap into all sorts of other industries and bring them together to get the best and possibly the most long-term solution for those things. So yeah, I don't know quite how we got from past 2035 to talking about local retrofitted biodiverse rich neighbourhoods, but that's the opportunity.
No, that definitely makes sense, and I suppose this is a continuation from another question about how do we educate and influence consumers to appreciate fabric first before changing their heating systems, particularly as there's a lot of talk around energy costs and energy usage for consumers and pushing of pumps and networks. So how do we educate and influence around the fabric first before we start tackling that? Or should we be? Is that the approach we should? Or what do you think?
Well, this is a really great question that Sarah and I are going to fight over to try and answer, and it's a great question because I think there's a huge part that consumers have to play and understand. There's also a big part of the media that has to fundamentally get what's been discussed and frame or ask research and questions that perhaps hasn't been done just now. But I think it's a good point. I just saw in the chat there about, there's a move to heat pumps. Yeah, heat pumps are absolutely part of the mix. They will be part of the mix. They should be part of the mix. But without shamelessly plugging our podcast, what we need to look at is how do existing heating systems work. So if we take fabric first as you have to reduce demand in as much as you can, that could probably be over a phased approach, whether that's using past 2035 or not. But what we have to also think about is low temperature heating systems, and we have to think about how the radiators, the system itself, is set up to accommodate a future heat pump. And I think there's probably another webinar, Kaye, about how we can educate consumers in that you don't necessarily need a heat pump just now, but you do need a system that can accommodate a heat pump in the future.
Yeah, 100%. I recommend, if people are looking for interesting and tangible sources of knowledge right now, if you're talking about how do I talk to my clients right now, Leah Robson from Your Energy Your Way and Joe Alsop are two leaders in the field of this, and they have been doing a lot of work around just talking about reducing the flow temperature of your boiler and understanding just how your boilers work, and the fact that we're all running them too high, we're all wasting too much energy anyway. And that starts to educate people around how their system works, not just that we've got a boiler on a wall and it's either on or it's off and it costs however much it costs per unit of gas, but actually how do you make that as efficient as possible, and starting to engage with what people already have and giving people the power to feel comfortable around the system they already have before terrifying the wits out of everybody and saying, here's a heat pump and it's electric, and people aren't quite ready to make such a huge jump. Well, I mean, nobody should be, expected to make such a huge jump without actually familiarity and empowerment around the things that they already have, and to see a tangible improvement in the efficiency of the system they've already got through reducing that starts that conversation. You then start to talk about, well, how else is heat lost? And you can start to talk about how your building works and doesn't work. But I'd nearly say, if people want to become, I keep wanting to just turn this back to the audience in a way. Now is the time for collaboration, and if you are keen and frustrated about the lack of particular areas of support or knowledge, or reach out to us, reach out to ACAN, reach out to the ACB, reach out to BEST and say, look, this is a blind spot, we need more support in this. And there will either be a working group or a task force somewhere trying to work on this, or something that you can either join if you had the opportunity and resource to do so. But we're always, the more hands we can have around this stuff, the quicker that we can deliver that. But it's a really key part, and the public engagement bit is really a challenge, particularly when, and I'll try not to be too cynical here, but particularly when our government isn't doing what it should be doing. When we should be in the situation of having public service broadcasts about how efficient is your boiler. We were happy enough to tell everybody to stay home. We should be happy during the pandemic. We should be happy as a country, as a nation, as a set of nations should be comfortable in caring for people right now and saying, here are some tips. And that should really then open the floodgates for more conversation around that. And in the meantime, we'll just keep hammering away here.
Absolutely. And, you know, another question, I suppose that this is someone that does want to see positive in action. They're asking, you know, we're hearing a lot about national strategies driving and supporting deep retrofit of existing buildings, but are there actual, you know, there's a gap there of, you know, practical application in terms of scale and scope. And I know that some of you, yeah, Duncan, I was going to say, you know, is there any good news stories there? Is there any positives like that we can take?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What we're talking about here is the technical bit, is the how. I mean, we can talk. Sara and I can talk about building physics and how we reduce that demand. I think there's a bigger conversation, and I'm very encouraged by government, from the governments that I speak to, and senior policymakers, because that's just one part of a three-part issue. The second part is how we finance that. If we accept the fact that we need to spend significantly more to retrofit our homes than we had, you know, anticipated 10, 20 years ago, I think the energy costs are actually making that more palatable. You know, I will spend upwards of £30,000 heating essentially a new build over the next decade. So if retrofit is going to cost money, I can actually justify that in quite a short period of time. But I think that's how we're part of the UN Centre of Excellence as a UK, and Scott Foster, who's the Director of Sustainable Energy, has a really good point. We pay for energy in an old-fashioned way, and I think what we possibly have to move to is paying for heat as a service, or paying for comfort as a service, where you might contract with a company that provides you 21 degrees, 18 hours a day, so on, and that costs you a certain amount, in the same way you would do for broadband and so on. So I think there's a receptiveness due to the crisis just now around how that can play out. But how that's delivered is something that I think we need to have a national conversation about. Do we allow a market to deliver these measures at scale? And if so, how do we regulate that market? Or do we look at potentially the state and the market contracting together for entities that can deliver that for the public good? So there's some really exciting policy questions just now. I'm quite encouraged by the conversations we have across the UK.
I noticed there was a question further up about a law of diminishing return on fabric first approach. I think this is also a really good question, because this is the question of retrofit, like how deep do you go? And should we all be focusing on deep retrofit? And it comes back to what Duncan was talking about as well, about the pyramid of success. And we've come to talking about it like that, whether it's a pyramid or a wedge, but essentially it's really important that we have, you know, really high standards, I suppose, through whether it's Passive House, whether it's Retrofit, whether it's ACB standards, whatever those are, but we've got high standards that we can aim for, but that we may or may not be able to deliver that because of cost, because of current circumstances, because the external factors haven't changed maybe the way we would hope them to just yet. But they might, and they could do. And so therefore what's important is, there's no doubt that we do need to do this to millions of buildings. We do need to retrofit them. So the most important thing is understanding, how do you set a plan for that building? How do you aim for that high standard that allows you, as those external conditions, whether it's the financial situation, whatever those situations are, as they change, that you can be moving along that path, protected, you know, that the risk is managed, that you're not going to do more damage to the building and the health of the occupants than you would otherwise. You don't want to do single measures, you don't want to do short-term thinking, you want to do long-term thinking, and that's part of the cultural change that we need to see, where we're starting to view our buildings as things that we're caring for in the long term. And there are a number of suggested initiatives and things that are you know, being bandied around the industry to see what might stick, and I think we will see those things change. We will see you know, a shift in how that works. We'll see a shift in how the different maybe the stamp duties might work, all of those sorts of things that might become more incentives to doing that. So, but there is a sort of a diminishing return, and I think if you look at the Letty retrofit guide, that covers it really well. It covers really well, you know, what happens if you reduce, if you add this much insulation, what happens to the building? At what point do those things become less? And it's important, I suppose, to understand where the grid and the decarbonisation of the grid impacts in there as well. But rather than us get too deep into that with a few minutes left to go, have a read. That Let's Retrofit guide is very accessible, really clear, and full of other links to other bits of sources of information for that as well.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We've got time very quickly for the very last question before we close off for today. The question here: do you think by employing a retrofit coordinator by a company will not create a conflict of interest? It's a bit hard for a coordinator to work against employers' interests, really. Meanwhile, tricky to ensure the public and the client interest at the same time. This is something that you might be or
blimey, Kaye, this is the libelous question, isn't it? This is the how to maintain a diplomatic answer to this question.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, I think I'm not going to criticise people for their own particular practices. What I would say is that past 20, finally, what Sarah was saying, just relating to the last question, is that if we are going to do things in a phased approach, past 2035 as a process is very good to do that, because it is quite good for identifying where you're going to lock in risk about future improvements, I think anyway. I think in an ideal world, let me phrase it like this, if this can navigate a course. I think in an ideal world you would want to have a past 2035 retrofit contracted by the client and a contractor undertaking that work. That would be my preference. I'm not going to tell other people how they should do things or get into conflict of interest, but the point about the retrofit coordinator role is it's subjective and independent, or at least should be. I know that it is allowed, and that's up to people to take for their take on it, but I think it should be objective and independent. Maybe Trish can help me out here before I go and get the lawyer's notebook.
I think the important thing about the PAS process itself is it's just trying to look at risk mitigation, and also that we don't have unintended consequences, which we've had through, other phases of us trying to do retrofit in the past. The important thing about the role is just not that it's accredited, it's that we understand that process. So whether you're an accredited retrofit coordinator or someone who completely understands the process and you're all working together to actually have better outcomes, then I think that's the key thing to understand. It should not just be restricted to government funded programmes. It's actually just a good process to actually have a whole house plan, like Sarah was saying, whether you do one increment of something to your building like external insulation, that you understand the risks of doing that, and also that when you do have money, time, and as the industry changes, which it will, there's no question about that happening, and more legislation to help that happen, that you can have the whole house plan and we don't do things back to front like we did previously. I think as a process, yes. Do you have to have it for every project? I would say probably not, but you do need to understand how to mitigate risk.
I would just add to that as well that it should, often when you see, when people view like new roles being created as though here's another thing that we have to pay for, this is a massive opportunity at the beginning of your project to make sure that you are de-risking and therefore ensuring the success of the outcome of your project by somebody who is there to look after the interests in a very much more collaborative way. So I think this is slightly more to do with us all in the industry really getting to understand where that role sits, and the fact that it is about bringing things together, bringing people together, making sure that there isn't the problems that we've seen in the past. So I think we have to start viewing that role as something that is very, very supportive and not something that's there. This isn't value engineering, or should we just call cost cutting? That's not what that is. This is about making sure that it is a safeguarded and as successful a project as it possibly can be. And only because I saw it somewhere up and somebody specifically asked about schools. You want any information about retrofit in schools, look to RAFT, Retrofit Action for Tomorrow, and Harry Paticus and the work that they're doing. Really, really great stuff, and that's about engagement and delivery of retrofit in schools.
Just two things, sorry, Kate, and I agree, Sarah, I saw that question, and I think Harry's a good shout as well, but there's some practical examples in Scotland, like Edinburgh. Patrick McGrath over in Edinburgh is doing some fantastic work, and I'm fairly sure there's an Retrofit school as well as just not far away from you in North Ayrshire or East Ayrshire, I think. One of the Ayrshires, I can find it and send a link on to Kaye. There's an Retrofit school over there. What I would say is a shameless plug in terms of retrofit assessor. I think a good charter surveyor, of which I am one, has a lot of the skills that you need to identify risk within buildings. So it doesn't have to be specifically, I agree, Trish, on social rented or eco projects that you employ a retrofit coordinator. However, charter surveyors have a good skill bank.
You're not offering your skills out now, are you, Duncan? I think you're busy enough these days.
Exactly.
Thanks everyone, and also thanks for the information that you've shared with the links, and if anyone that's been on the webinar today wants those links, they can get in touch with us and we can pass them on to them. So just to say thank you to all the speakers today, you've been fabulous. Thanks to Danielle, who has been working in the back as always, making sure everything's run smoothly. Just to remember that this is just one in a series of other modules that will run over the course of May, and there'll also be practical sessions run in our Innovation Factory. So please, after this, if you want to book onto one of them, do that just now, and make sure you're available for the Mass Timber webinar, which is next Tuesday as well. So thank you, and we hope to see you next week, and we hope to see you over at the Innovation Factory with the training as well. Thanks, Duncan, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Trish. Thank you.